Welcome back. I'm happy that you've chosen to join us again for Trauma-Informed Practices, what we call TIPS, and this is Module 2, ACEs and Symptoms. ACEs is Adverse Childhood Experiences, and the ACEs were developed by two physicians, one who worked for the Center for Disease Control and one who was employed by Kaiser Permanente. ACEs has become a profound tool and makes it possible for us to assess as we're just talking to people. Once we understand what those 10 components of ACEs are, what's actually happening with them, and to be able to identify specific forms of trauma that they may have experienced. So we're going to start out today with a video. I want to remind you again that you have the Padlet to access. And so I encourage you to go there and look at the color coding for today. I'll remind you at the end of this section and actually choose to take the ACEs and resiliency assessments for yourself. Now, there is a different kind of ACEs assessment that you will see there, and it's called Urban ACEs. This was developed in response to Black, Indigenous, people of color, and really captures more of experiences that they have living in environments that are different than where the ACEs study was originally taken. That was done in San Diego with primarily white middle-class people. And you'll learn a little bit about what the doctors found when they started asking a different sort of question to people. I utilize the ACEs in my work in a really, I think, very cool way. I'm listening to people all the time, and I have them memorized. There's just 10 of them. And I can listen for clues and cues about what might be going on and what might be actually impacting their behavior and choices that they're making in their life. What's the point of all this? Because our goal is to help people live the best life possible for them. That's what we all want. And so how do we do that? Well, the stories that we make up about life and people and how the world is, when we think about those ideas that we have, they're oftentimes formed before the age of 10. And we know a lot of them before the age of 4. We think about this, and so in order for us to really be able to identify what are those patterns, what are those stories that people are telling themselves about the world and what they should fear, and what's really true for them in present time, while being able to validate the experiences that they had or are in fact experiencing in present time. And for many of the children and adults that you're working with in foster care or in schools, those folks are still living with those traumatic events in real time right now. So let's dive in first, starting with the video that helps us understand what ACEs is, how it was developed, and how it can be useful to us as we serve those beautiful human beings that are in our classrooms, in our workspaces, and also for ourselves. Here we go.
What does your parents' divorce have to do with your risk for heart disease? If your mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up, are you more likely to suffer from depression as an adult? Here's what you should know about ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, extremely stressful events that can happen to a child growing up. Some experiences are so stressful that they can alter brain development, as well as the immune system, increasing the risk of lifelong health and social problems in adulthood. The term comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, landmark research that shed new light on the root cause of everything from stroke and liver disease to substance abuse and mental illness. In the late 1990s, an epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control and a preventive medicine doctor at Kaiser Permanente set out to understand the association between childhood experience and lifelong health. They asked over 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego about their health history, as well as difficult questions about their experiences growing up. Anda and Felitti tallied up 10 different kinds of adversity in this largely middle-class and college-educated population. They were stunned to see how common ACEs were. 21% of all respondents were sexually abused as children. 19% grew up with someone who suffered mental illness. 28% had been physically abused. And 2 out of 3 respondents had experienced at least one ACE. The researchers next looked at how someone's ACE score, or the number of adversities they experienced, related to a wide array of serious health and social problems. They saw that the more ACEs someone had, the greater their risk for poor outcomes compared with someone with no ACEs. Someone with an ACE score of 4 had twice the risk of heart disease and cancer. Someone with an ACE score of 5 had an 8 times greater chance of being an alcoholic. And those with an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years earlier. With every major problem they looked at in the ACE study, the risk went up for each additional adverse experience in childhood. As Dr. Robert Anda says, what's predictable is preventable. It's important to remember that ACEs are not destiny. ACEs are a tool for understanding the health of a population as a whole. For individuals, an ACE score can be a tool for understanding their own risk for health and social problems, and empower them to make changes for themselves and their children. ACEs tend to get passed down from generation to generation, and are common across all income levels, races, and cultures. But increasingly, people of all different professions and backgrounds are coming together to discuss how ACEs affect their communities. They're finding new ways to treat and prevent ACEs. Many doctors are starting to screen their patients for ACEs as part of their medical history. More schools are becoming trauma-informed, considering the source of problem behavior when disciplining their students, instead of immediately suspending or expelling them. To learn more about interrupting the cycle of adversity and improving health and well-being for the next generation, please visit kpjrfilms.co.
Now that we've talked about that and you've learned a little bit about what ACEs are, I want to share with you that my ACEs score is 8. And what we know is that anything that is over 4 can really compound outcomes for individuals throughout their lifetime, whether it's medically or behaviorally. Now, for some people, when they hear that, they're shocked and they say, oh my gosh, my destiny is already preformed. And I'm here today to tell you that that just is not true. What we have here is a tool that is powerful. Once I understand and know what my ACEs are, then I can go to the research that tells me what the potential outcomes for me could be. So what would that look like? A person with a score of 4 or more has a much higher likelihood of being obese. When I learned that fact, I was actually carrying around 60 extra pounds of weight. And what that informed me to do was to actually take back my power. And I recognized that I was carrying around that extra weight in response to, and for me, it helped me to feel protected as a child. Now, as a young person, our minds are so beautifully adaptive. They're so gorgeous. And they got us to this point. And so the question is, what do we do now? I didn't criticize that part of myself that did that to stay safe. It worked. And now as an adult, I wanted to be more physically healthy. So I made some changes in my life 9 years ago and released that weight and have been able to keep that weight off of me for these 9 years by doing a program. So I'm a big advocate for empowering people. It's not that the outcomes will be X, Y, Z. It's that the outcomes could be this. And if we intervene and do something differently, right? We know it's not enough just to have information. The question is, what are we going to do differently to change our behaviors so that then we will have different outcomes? So we'll delve into that more as we go through the series, but it's important for me to share with you that finding out my ACEs scores has been tremendously powerful for me in the way that I approach my own personal life, how I do things, what choices I make, because I can see the direct link to unhealthy behaviors and decisions, whether it's with food or whether it's with humans, other human beings, and the choices that I have made to keep me alive, that beautiful little kid. Thank you to that little kid. And I wanted to do something really different. So I changed stuff up and it dramatically improved my life. So let's talk a little bit here about really kind of the bottom line. Resmaa Menakem talks about that trauma is anything that happens that's too much, it's too fast, it's too long, it lasts too long, it's too soon. And we've talked about this already in the initial segment, right? It's coupled with not enough of what should have happened that is resourcing for us. So we know the definition of this, and I've really done shorthand with it. And I think about when I'm listening to people now, they're telling me about something that happened. It was too much, too soon, too fast. It went on for too long. And so that really is going back to that primary definition. And again, I want to remind you that that definition of what's too much, too soon, too fast, too long, boy, is it personal. It's so personal to each individual. So now that we've got that piece, let's dive in a little deeper and think about this ACEs assessment and what it found. So ACEs links or studies 10 types of childhood trauma. Now, it is not comprehensive. We have other ACEs out there that are more applicable to people who are living in certain environments, people who are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, etc., etc. We can add to that list people who are experiencing transphobia, homophobia, ableism, those kinds of things. So let's take a look here. So the 10 ACEs are physical, sexual, emotional abuse. So that's the first section that it measures with very simple, straightforward questions. Then it goes on to ask about physical and emotional neglect. Now the ACEs is simply a yes or no. It's very simple. It doesn't ask a person to go into these things. It just simply asks yes or no, did this happen? Living with a family member who's addicted to alcohol or other drugs, is depressed, has other mental illness, who's imprisoned, someone who witnessed a mother's abuse. And I want to pause here for a moment. This doesn't necessarily need to be just a mother's abuse. It could be a mother, a father, someone else living in the home, a grandparent, another sibling. What it's asking about is domestic abuse, whether it's physical or emotional. Did the person experience divorce or separation? And with these 10 things in mind, we can look at what we know is that when we look at these 4 types of childhood adversity, if the person has a score of 4 or more, if they say yes to 4 or more of those questions, here are the things that could happen. Alcoholism risk increases 700%. Attempted suicidality increases 1,200%. Heart disease, cancer, nearly double. And people with a high ACE score have more marriages, more broken bones, more depression, more prescription drug use, more obesity, etc. Now, I'm going to remind you of a really important point here. That is not the sentence. That is what can happen if we don't address in very real ways what is going on and help people to change their behavior. We know that feelings create thoughts, thoughts create actions, and those actions then determine the outcomes of our life. So when we back that up and look at that, that's cognitive behavioral therapy. When we look back and we unpack that backwards, we can oftentimes look at what is the story that this person is telling me and how can I be informed about what might be going on with them so I can change my conversation and be of assistance to them, whether it's giving them resources for help or just being kind to them or just being a listening ear, absent any judgment, that compassion piece. Let's move on now. Of course, when we talk about childhood trauma, they've included these areas, and there's 10 questions. But when we think about this, we know that there's lots of other areas, and I mentioned them just briefly before. Let's look at these things. Racism, right? And racism can be generational racism, and oftentimes for people is. So we carry that piece down with us. Homophobia or transphobia, bullying, watching a sibling being abused, losing a caregiver, homelessness, being unhoused, surviving and recovering from a severe accident, witnessing a father being abused by a mother, etc., etc. So this list isn't comprehensive, and I'm listening with a carefully tuned ear when I'm listening to folks for other things that they are telling me through their own descriptors and their own lenses were actually impactful for them in terms of creating trauma for them. It's a guideline. So if a person has experienced other types of toxic stress, then that may likely increase the risk of that person for health consequences or poor behavioral outcomes, and poor outcomes in schools. So this is where you come in the picture, and you're so important. That listening piece, when you're providing an EAP, when you're talking to parents, when you can engage a counselor with a kid who's specially trained to talk about these kinds of things. So you can really step in and help in that way. Bessel van der Kolk is a very famous trauma specialist, and in the resources, I've given you a link to NCIBM, which is a beautiful resource if you choose to take it to the next level to take courses. They have online courses that dive in depth about trauma, different kinds of trauma. How do we resolve trauma? What are therapeutic modalities? And you may be thinking, well, Jamie, I'm not a therapist. Oh my goodness, you are the most important person in this child's life as a teacher who can really see them and assess and decide what might be a good thing for them. So I've taken these classes and they're just absolutely amazing. And you can write them off as an educational expense on your taxes, which is quite lovely. Bessel is one of the people that is employed in this training modality most often, and he wrote several books. Please feel free to Google him. I recommend everything he's ever written. And here, let's look at his definition of trauma. Trauma is an inability to inhibit one's body without being possessed by its defenses, and the emotional numbing that shuts down experiences, which include pleasure and satisfaction. So how do we increase a life and create lives for students and for ourselves where we feel pleasure and satisfaction with how things are going for us and what we're doing? It's important that we start with understanding the symptomology. What might I be seeing in this child who is sitting in front of me? So let's talk about 4 of the big things. And of course, trauma can manifest in many ways, but here's the 4 that I really want to focus on as you're just starting out here. I invite you again to take other classes from other organizations or attend one of my classes where we dive in and spend even 8 hours about these topics, just really up close and personal. Where the starting point, though, is with these 4. Let's talk about those. Hyperarousal. So we know that our body has multiple brains. And one of the aspects of that we know is that we have what is called an amygdala. It's the most primal part of our brain. It is that thing that kept us alive and got us here. As cave people, it was that part of our brain that told us that cave lion is coming for me and I better run or I better fight, right? We think about it in terms of fight, flight, and freeze. We've just added in academia a new piece of that. So there's now 4 Fs. It's now fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And fawn is a behavior that you may see quite a bit with the people that you're working with. So you'll see people actually get quiet and withdrawn and even sometimes get real small or advocate for the very person that is the perpetrator. They may be defensive for the person who is actually harming them in that moment. And we might look at this and think it's typically seen in domestic violence with domestic violence victims. And we look at that and think, why would you do that? Well, gosh, it's worked for them for a long time and it's trained behavior for them. So they go into hyperarousal, and hyperarousal may look like also hypoarousal, which is the opposite of someone getting real quiet. And so when we think about these things, it's really important for us to understand what that looks like. And there's symptomology that you can identify when you're working with people. You can just be paying attention to, do they have an increased heart rate? Are they talking really fast, or are they withdrawn? Are they having difficulty breathing, or is it rapid breathing? Are they breaking out in a sweat? Can you see them tense when they're talking to you? Do they have a constriction in their body? A narrowing of perception? Now, this is a really key one. When we think about this piece, the amygdala is not very smart. It kept us alive, but it only has a few functions. Our prefrontal cortex is that rational, reasonable part of our brain. It's so wise. It's so great. The problem is that in a perceived or real emergency, the amygdala will do what's called an amygdala hijack and come in and actually take over. We're going to talk about that more later on, but a person cannot help this. And during those moments, they may have really that narrowing of perception. And what that looks like is that things are right or wrong, black or white, this or that. Very binary thinking. And so I listen for that in conversations, that there's only one way to do things. And that is a tell for me that someone may in this moment be activated. And so I need to slow it way down and back the boat up and really get back down to basics, because I'm talking to that part of their brain which is concerned with survival. And the first thing I need to do in that moment is tell them, you're safe with me. In this moment right now, you're safe with me. I got you here. So let's just slow it all down and take a breath and get a drink of water. Maybe even go out and take a walk. And then we'll look at this just a little bit more and see if there's not some other options that may really work for you. You may also see abrupt mood swings with someone. So, a lot of times these things get diagnosed and we put a label on someone that they've got some kind of a mental health disorder, and we run to the DSMR. When what we know is true is that may or may not be the case. It could also be a result of trauma. And so it may be a rage reaction that you see in your classroom. It may be someone just really losing their marbles, temper tantrums, frequent anger or crying, shame, the most destructive emotion of all. You may see that. This may be a tell for you. Reduced ability to deal with stress, difficulty sleeping is a big one for people who suffer from toxic stress, PTSD, and CPTSD. You may have that really tired student. They're just exhausted all the time. I invite you to ask some questions. Hey, I'm noticing that it looks like you're really tired. Is that true? I've kind of seen a pattern of this. Am I seeing that? Is that what I'm really seeing? Would you be willing to share with me what's going on for you? How are you? And just asking some of those questions and inviting that piece for them. They may have panic attacks, anxiety, extreme anxiety, phobias, mental blankness, or spaced out feelings. That kid that is in your class or that you're working with around getting them rehoused, and they have a hard time paying attention to the train of conversation that you're having with them, pay attention to that. This may be a symptom of trauma. Avoidance behavior. They may want to avoid places, moments, activities, memories, or people, and they may be attracted to dangerous situations. Our central nervous systems, when we are raised in an environment where there is continual violence around us, whether it's emotional or physical or neglect, we can be attracted to those things because our central nervous system is trained to feel that way. So when things are really calm and peaceful for us, it feels weird. So you'll see people who are attracted to people who aren't good for them, and they want to go play with those kids or act like those kids or be like those kids. That may also be a tell for you. Addictive behaviors. Kaiser Permanente looked deep into this and had developed several programs just around this. Overeating, drinking, smoking, taking drugs, using drugs, exaggerated or diminished sexual activity. We know that child in school, especially with children who identify as a girl, who we see as promiscuous, many of those children have suffered sexual abuse, or they're experiencing emotional neglect at home and they're trying to get attention there. Lots of good books about how that works and ways that we can actually assist them to point them in directions where they're doing things that are in support of them and will keep them safer. Someone may actually have amnesia or forgetfulness about what happened. This is very common, especially when they're in what we call the lizard brain, the amygdala, with a primal brain, all different names for the same thing. They may not remember. This is a protection. It's a protection that our bodies and our beautiful brains created for us, and at some point, it really becomes maladaptive. So that's the key here. A lot of these pieces we look at and we think, it's just maladaptive behavior. Well, the truth is, in cases with trauma, most of those behaviors were actually adaptive in a way that may have saved that kid's life. They learned how to behave in a way that got the attention that they needed, or got them to not get the attention that they didn't want, etc. And their body adjusted to those pieces. So what is it that we need to do? Really looking at those things with deep compassion. And I praise that. That was so adaptive at the time. That was really a great way to handle it because it kept you alive. And now the situation is different. If it is. If it's not different, then there's different steps that we need to make. We added to the Padlet just this morning a list of resources under the VCOE heading that has gobs of resources that you can go to point these kids and adults in directions. Not expecting you to be the expert about that. Your job is to listen and to assess and really pay attention to what's going on so that then you can be of assistance to them and point them in the right directions. What's some of the symptomology that we might see? Again, this is Bessel van der Kolk. When trauma is triggered, we may regress into primal states of fear. We may react aggressively. We may become paralyzed and not be able to assess the level of threat. Our automatic danger signals are disturbed and we become hyper or hypoactive, aroused, maybe numbed out. So we need to be able to differentiate when we're looking at a child that we think is just sitting in the back of the classroom and they're not paying attention, and that kid is just checked out, and you've just said something and that you asked them a question and they're checked out. What's really going on here? Behavior is a tell oftentimes for us about other things, and you know that as kind and compassionate human beings. Let's look at some more trauma symptoms. An inability to love, nurture, or bond with other individuals. You may see that. Fear of dying or having a shortened life. The person is constantly talking about that kind of thing. Self-mutilation, which we know is back on the rise in the United States. And so there's lots of data and information about tells and things that you can look for around self-mutilation. If you see that child and you think that they're cutting, the time is to act. And you don't have to have all the answers. We're hoping that we've given you enough resources that you know where to go so that you can get the help you need. Loss of sustaining beliefs. Excessive shyness. Now, we're not talking about someone who's introverted, but that excessive shyness. They're not participating. They're closed off. They're not engaging with other kids or adults. So we want to really pay attention to that one. Diminished emotional responses. So that person who's just kind of numbed out all the time. We think about that. They're not showing joy or happiness or anger or anything. It's just that numb feeling. An inability to make commitments. Now this comes from they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And they didn't know what was going to happen tomorrow. So making commitments, often those commitments had been broken by other people as well. So teaching people how to make little tiny steps towards making those commitments and then making sure that we show up for those things. Chronic fatigue or low physical energy. Immune system problems. Psychosomatic illness, which could be headaches, migraines, neck and back problems, chronic pain, Asthma is a huge tell potentially that we are dealing with someone that is traumatized. It doesn't mean it unilaterally, but it can be a huge tell. If I see a kid or an adult who has asthma, they're morbidly obese, they have learning disabilities that have been identified or not, they're showing me some other behavioral things, I make a big question mark in my head. What's actually happening with this person? And more importantly, what happened to them so that they are carrying these things forward in their life today? Depression and feelings of impending doom, detachment, alienation, isolation. We think about that as the living dead syndrome. Reduced ability to formulate plans. Again, that ties right in with inability to make commitments. And then finally, and most painfully, a reenactment of the actual trauma. So we may see someone who grew up in a domestic violence household or is growing up in a domestic violence household, then move to date people or have friends who actually are physically violent with them. It could be that someone is also growing up in a household with someone that has a cluster B personality disorder. One of those disorders is narcissism. We may see that child or that adult attracted to, engaged with, spending time with friends who are, in fact, acting in ways that are selfish or even narcissistic. Why is that? Because they have been soaked in that soup for their whole life. That's what they know. So what do? We explain to them and help them to see that there are different ways to have friendships and relationships, that there are people out there that will actually love us and care about us. And that takes time for us to do. So this is the brief introduction to the symptomology piece and what ACEs is. I want to ask you and invite you to go to the Padlet and look at the green section. And those resources there, you will find the ACEs. I invite you to take it. When you take it, please do it in a place where you have some privacy, and know that for yourself, I'm aware that one of those 10 questions or more may impact you and actually be activating for you. So I invite you to do it at a time when you're feeling peaceful, you have some time, you can take a walk afterwards, and reading through the questions sometimes is activating, and it's important for us to know what those questions are so that we can take a look at them. Then I invite you to take the resiliency questionnaire, also by Kaiser Permanente and CDC, and it asks a different set of questions. Who was there for you? Who showed up for you? Did you have XYZ in your household? Who took care of you? You'll find all those on the Padlet under the green section, and then many more articles and videos if you want to explore that. There's a TED Talk that I invite you to look at by Dr. Nadine Burke Harris. It's brilliantly done. She is a big researcher around this and has written 2 books about trauma. Her first, The Deepest Well, is an exceptional book. If you love reading and love learning, it's a great place to start with her TED Talk, and then consider looking at her book, which she also reads on Audible, a lovely resource. Here's the takeaways from today. It's key for us to first understand what we're seeing. It's not the behavior. The bad behavior is not acceptable. We know that. It's us choosing to look underneath what is actually going on with that kid, that they are behaving in this way. Dr. Marshall Rosenberg says that every action is an attempt to get a need met. So the need for a child who is acting out in class may be attention, recognition, to be seen. They may have a need to matter. They may have a need to belong. They may have a need for fun and play. It may be lots of things going on for them. When we stop judging the behavior itself, which I understand is disruptive, and we start to look and peel back the layers of that onion to why is that kid doing this thing? Why are they behaving in that way? Why has Susie all of a sudden pulled back? Her energy's pulled back in class. She's not raising her hand anymore. What's going on with that kid? And asking some questions. It's important to say here too that you're not psychotherapists. What you can be, though, is the gatekeeper to those different resources for the families and those kids. And that's the beautiful work here. So check out the Padlet. Again, you have the resources there for Foster Youth Services Coordinating Program and the Homeless Education Program. So you can tap in there. I invite you, if you wish, to let me know if you have questions. My information is all over the Padlet with contact information. If there's a resource that you may like that is not included on the Padlet, I invite you to reach out and I will do my best to find something for you. We did limit the number of resources there because we didn't want to overwhelm folks. And again, this is just a starting place for you. So you now understand the basics. What is ACEs? Why is ACEs so important and critical in us understanding health and behavioral outcomes for folks, emotional outcomes for folks? Our goal is to help people live the best life they can by teaching and fostering and caring for folks. And so these are the first pieces, and we'll be delving in next and thinking about what is the actual academic impact for kids who experience trauma. And we'll look at that in the next piece. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to seeing you in the next session. Have a great afternoon.